Hello there. You may notice in the last video I used the terms function and subroutine somewhat interchangeably. In this one, we'll discuss their differences and why you would use one or the other. We also used the message box function in the last video, which can be a useful debugging tool. Here, we'll look at some other helpful debug tools as well. In other languages, functions are groups of code that can have inputs and outputs. A function may have a series of parameters to adjust to current conditions, or it may return values to be used by other functions. Inside each function, we get our own set of variables that we can use, and most of what we do will be contained within that function unless we specify otherwise. VBA is very similar. Functions and subroutines can both have their own sets of parameters, but only functions can return a value. Let's put together a subroutine similar to the Hello World example, but this time with a parameter name. Like before, we'll use the keyword sub to define the subroutine, and we'll just call this one hello. Unlike the last one, within the parentheses, we'll place our parameter name. Notice that we have to use the keyword as to define what type of variable name will be. We hit enter. And like before, we'll use message box, and this time we'll say hello. Oops. And then we'll add name here. So that this way the message box that pops up will say hello and whatever we put here. So we click within this and we try to run it, and unfortunately there's an error. Well, not really an error, but we can't run it the way it is like we ran the last one because this subroutine requires that parameter to have an argument passed to it. So we'll click cancel here. One thing that we can do is define something like a main subroutine with no parameters, and then within this we will call hello, hit space, and like with message box we see our tooltip down here, and we'll just say this. Now we click within here, press play, and we see our message like we expected. One of the benefits of putting your code into separate subroutines like this is we can easily reuse sections of code and change the parameters like this. So now if we hit play, we see our first one, our second one, and our third one. This can make your code very, easier to read, and when we get into things like loops and later on, it can really help with the flow of whatever you're trying to do. Now we'll take a look at functions. A function is very similar in setup. It can take some values as parameters, it can do something with them, and then this time it will return a value. So let's make a calculator that adds two numbers together. We'll use the word function, and let's just call this add two values, and we'll have a number 1. We'll just do an integer. I'm using these variable types here. In the next video, we'll go into a lot more detail in the types of variables, but for now, just kind of go along with it. And like we have to define what types of data types these variables are, we have to define what this function is as well. Since we're adding two integers together, we'll say that this is also an integer. And in most languages, you could just type something like return and whatever value you want. VBA is a little bit different. You actually have to use the name of the function, and we'll just say that that's num1 and num2. So now if we go back to our main subroutine up here, we can just say, let's do message box, and let's call this add two values. Okay, our first number, let's just say 4, and for our second number, let's say 3. And one thing to note here is when we call these subroutines, even though we put the parameters in parentheses, we don't actually use parentheses here. But for functions, we do have to use parentheses. I don't know why VBA is like that. It's somewhat confusing. It can make it hard to find subroutines that you've called when you're just looking through your code quickly, but that's the way it is. So we take this, we run it, we're going to see our 3 messages, and if everything's correct, we should see our 2 values added together. Now, like subroutines, it's possible for us to create a function that will return a value but not take in any parameters. So let's say we wanted to have a function called pi that just returned the value of pi. And we'll just call this a double, which means that we can have a decimal point in the value here. And we'll just say that pi equals, if I remember my math correctly, should just be 22 divided by 7. We'll go up here, and we'll just call pi with our parentheses. Hit play, go through our messages, 1, 2, 3. 4 plus 3 is still 7. And we get a value here for pi, which is pretty close, but truncated, obviously. Now these have all been very simple scripts, so finding a mistake would be relatively easy. This is usually not the case, however, and VBA gives us a couple of tools to help us out. We've already used the message box, which is useful for communicating to the user, but it can also be used to call out values at important steps in your code, while also giving your code a pause for you to figure out what's going on. If you have to have a loop, though, that iterates thousands of times, clicking through all that can be very annoying. This is a good case to use the immediate window, which can be thought of as a console in other languages. Now, we don't see it right now on the main screen, so we'll have to show it under View, and we'll click the immediate window. Now down here, we'll get an output that we can call to instead of using message box. Let's try to use the immediate window. And we can print to this using debug print space and that. So if I click play, okay, we see message, 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 another message. And now instead of getting a message box, this prints down here and we don't have to click anywhere to advance the code. Another nice thing about the immediate window is we can actually call these subroutines or functions and put in parameters before we run them. So if we wanted to do something like hello, and let's just say debug window, whoops, hit enter, and we can see that we ran that subroutine up here without going to our main sub. So this is a great way to isolate parts of your code, run them with different types of values, and see what you get. Finally, if you do make a mistake and your code fails, you have the option of clicking on debug on the error window. So let's go back to this add two values where we require integers. Let's say instead of an integer, we put a string in here, and we try to run this. Okay, the code works, works. And now we have an issue here. Now we can just end it and go back to our editor, or we can click debug. And sometimes this isn't very helpful, but most of the time it can give you a good starting point where it'll highlight where the issue was, and it'll give you some type of reason, where in this case it said that we had a value mismatch where it wanted an integer, but it got a string. If these seem a little confusing right now, don't worry, we're going to use them a lot more. I'm going to try to leave in as many mistakes as possible as I go through this so you can kind of see. A lot of times I'll try to throw out a bunch of code really quickly with an idea of what I want, and then I'll just try to run through it. And I'll find all these errors, and throughout these errors, I'll determine what I need to fix. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.